We begin where the glittering excess seemed to hold all the answers. The weight of gold, piled high and dazzling in the afternoon sun, promised a life measured by its luster. Everything about it screamed permanence, undeniable success. It was an intoxicating illusion, the belief that true worth could be quantified, banked, displayed. The rich man gazed upon this mountain of coin, his expensive suit feeling suddenly like a costume, ill-fitting and fragile. He had always associated accumulation with achievement. The more he possessed, the more complete he believed himself to become. This was not merely about money, it was about validation. It was the anxious desire to prove, to every rival, every observer, and most urgently to himself, that his existence held immense value. But as the initial flush of material triumph began to subside, a deeper silence set in. The gold did not answer any questions. In fact, it amplified them. It threw back a chaotic reflection that he found increasingly difficult to bear. What was this endless striving? Was the summit always higher than the last? And if happiness remained perpetually out of reach, just beyond the next acquisition, what exactly was the point of climbing? His thoughts became restless rivers, swirling through passages of doubt. He began to question the very architecture of his desire. Was it pleasure itself that he chased, or merely the temporary anesthetic that seemed to accompany its arrival? He remembered whispers, echoes from forgotten texts and quiet conversations, about a different kind of wealth, one untradeable and unburdened by market fluctuations. The weight of expectation settled over him like a cloak woven of silken threads, yet feeling heavier than any lead. To maintain this life was to live permanently on stage. Every smile had to be perfectly calibrated, every gesture, restrained elegance. Failure meant not just financial ruin, but the shattering of an carefully constructed public mythology. He found himself trapped in the gilded cage of his own reputation. The internal landscape shifted, demanding a radically different geography. The focus began to pull away from what he could accumulate and toward what he could sustain within himself. If all external structures were temporary, if markets crashed, if fortunes faded, if the weight of opinion proved crushing, then where did genuine security lie? The question pulsed with relentless urgency. He sought contrast. He needed moments of quiet friction to test the fragile scaffolding of his reality. And so, he found himself wandering away from the polished marble and velvet drapery, drawn instead toward places that resisted definition. An enclosed garden, a dusty courtyard, the untamed edges of the city itself. The silence held a peculiar authority. Here, surrounded by things unconcerned with human valuation, the tenacious ivy climbing the wall, the humble dirt underfoot, he began to hear something faint, yet powerfully resonant. It was not a loud pronouncement or a grand epiphany. It was the quiet murmuring wisdom that seemed to belong only to time itself. He considered resilience. He observed the cultivated flowers in their orderly beds and then looked past them, noticing the defiant vitality of weeds pushing up through cracks in the pavement. The flowers required attention, pruning, perfect conditions. But the weed, it needed nothing more than a sliver of broken concrete and time to persist. Its strength was not in beauty or rarity, but in its sheer, stubborn refusal to disappear. The difference struck him with the clarity of cold water. His own life felt like an overly manicured garden, beautiful for presentation, perhaps, but brittle under true stress. Could he be as inherently resilient, as fundamentally self-sufficient as that seemingly insignificant growth pushing through the stone? The comparison was painfully humbling. The thought experiment then became unavoidable. He began to strip away his possessions mentally, meticulously removing them one by one. First, the fine fabrics of his clothing. Next, the seamless flow of capital across various accounts. With each imaginary loss, a hollow space opened up in his envisioned self. The panic was palpable, a sudden vertigo. This vast, echoing emptiness felt terrifying. He expected to feel nothing, perhaps disappointment, but instead he found an unnerving stillness. The realization was brutal in its simplicity. The empty spaces were not voids. They were reservoirs. What remained after stripping away the labels of success, the items of desire, and the mechanisms of wealth? What remained was merely the beating heart within his chest, the core consciousness that had survived every illusion. This internal audit expanded to include time itself. He began watching the city at night, observing cycles far removed from the anxious consumption he knew. He watched figures moving through squares. Some bent over their tasks until exhaustion seemed imminent. Others lay in profound repose, sleeping deeply, undisturbed by the anxieties of tomorrow or the regrets of yesterday. The contrast was profound. Exhaustion bought with ambition appeared loud and desperate. Genuine rest, however, that silent sinking into deep sleep, that state of peaceful being, seemed to contain an immense richness that no number could ever approximate. It spoke not of having, but simply of being in accord with the natural ebb and flow. Then came the unsolicited act, a simple interaction, unscripted by profit or expectation. He witnessed a man helping another lift a fallen object, exchanging only a glance of shared humanity, a gesture wholly divorced from recognition or reward. It was profound generosity operating without the slightest whisper of self-promotion. This casual exchange ripped open his old valuation system like thin linen. Suddenly, in this fleeting moment, he understood that true value resided not in receipt, but in genuine transmission. The need to understand enough grew into an obsession. He found himself sharing quiet meals with an aged friend, a man who had consciously chosen a life rich only in narrative and presence, having shed the demands of high finance decades ago. This friend spoke of content by simply describing routine, the smell of damp earth after rain, the rhythm of the seasons, the reliable comfort of simple labor. It was not a boast. It was merely inventorying joy. The challenge from this gentle source was direct and devastating. Why chase what diminishes your ability to taste the present? What purpose did wealth serve if its acquisition perpetually prevented you from settling into a sustained state of peace? The friend guided him toward freedom, suggesting that true solvency lies in recognizing limits, the limit of need, the limit of desire. This contemplation deepened until it became an almost painful ritual. He began to list his desires, mentally traversing every object he coveted, every title he yearned for. A fancy car, a vast library, the adoration of a crowd. For each item he forced himself to find its hidden tether, the underlying anxiety or fear that made the desire feel essential. The desperate need to appear successful, the craving for admiration. These attachments were not anchors of joy. They were chains fashioned from cognitive illusion. The profound freedom began in the act of surrender, not giving up ambition entirely, but surrendering the necessity of success for self-definition. The understanding dawned that resistance itself was a form of suffering. Letting go, allowing things to be what they are, simply and without struggle, was inherently liberating. This journey culminated in a deep study of emotional distance, or apatheia. He sought out the calm of water, where surface ripples quickly settled back into placid reflection. Here, he began practicing the great detachment. He understood that his inner peace was not contingent upon the market remaining stable, nor upon his investments performing optimally, nor upon anyone's approval. Emotional stability, he realized, had to be a fortress built from within, independent of circumstance. The inevitable wobble came in the form of small failure. In his calculated attempt to navigate back into the world of high achievement, he made a noticeable mistake, a missed connection, a slight misstep during an important presentation simulation. Initially, the familiar surge of panic was overwhelming. The fear of professional humiliation, the immediate calculation of reputational damage. But this time, something held fast within him. Instead of spiraling into self-recrimination, he felt only a curious sense of lightness. The crisis did not shatter him. It merely proved that his inner equilibrium could absorb the blow. The subsequent mental preparation became akin to martial training, but for the spirit. He subjected himself to imagined stress, hearing harsh criticism that in past life would have been agonizing, receiving news of unexpected setbacks. And each time, he returned to a center of stillness. His core remained stubbornly stable, impervious to external emotional weather. He realized inner fortitude was not about being immune to pain, but being unable to let others or circumstances dictate his internal state. He eventually found himself back within the lavish setting, the dinner party atmosphere that once defined him. The expectations still hung heavy in the air, a palpable pressure. But this time, the self-performance machine was switched off. He did not strive for the perfect, witty reply or the impressive anecdote. Instead, he chose truth and genuine empathy. He spoke honestly about the difficulty of asking oneself what enough truly means. His vulnerability, unexpected in that pristine room, did more to change the dynamic than any display of wealth ever could. It shifted the conversation from status to shared humanity. The final walk through his city felt utterly transformed. The architecture was no longer merely a backdrop for opulent living. It was a collection of enduring human stories. The faces passing by were not potential business contacts, but intricate mosaics of existence, each bearing its own untold struggle and quiet resilience. The quality of the natural light seemed to emphasize inherent beauty, independent of the camera lens or the social setting. The destination, finally, was nowhere grand or glittering. It was a simple activity, walking slowly, reading an old book, observing the effortless rhythm of existing. This quiet routine became his ultimate measure of wealth. The deep, unshakable realization settled upon him. Self-acceptance was not merely a pleasant feeling. It was the most valuable, untouchable commodity in human existence. He had found that the greatest riches were not those piled high in vault rooms, but the unshakable peace of knowing he was enough, simply by being. The air in the atrium courtyard was cool and still. It held a quiet weight, disturbed only by the distant rustle of sandals on worn marble. Here, surrounded by the aged geometry of architecture, the protagonist sat alone. The echoes of what had been said, words whispered from ancient texts, words that spoke of endurance and reason, were subtle yet profound. They did not arrive with fanfare or sudden revelation, but with a steady, insistent rhythm, like the steady beat of his own rational mind. The weight of accumulated possessions, visible perhaps only in the shine of a nearby statue or the discarded luxury fabric from an earlier memory, suddenly seemed loud. It was a frantic glitter that fought against the gentle murmur of stoic principle. For years, he had allowed the external gloss, the acquisition of gold, the prestige of titles, the size of his estate, to dictate the rhythm of his existence, believing that volume equated to value. But here, in this quiet space echoing with Seneca's whispers, the material brilliance seemed less like splendor and more like a desperate distraction. He listened closely, not just to the words recited aloud, but to the very premise they presented, that true good resides solely within the citadel of the mind. The pursuit of wealth, he realized with sudden clarity, was often merely an elaborate distraction from introspection. It demanded attention, required constant performance, and ultimately kept him perpetually looking outward, forever measuring his worth against the fluctuating tides of fortune. He thought back to the chaotic energy of the city squares, the hurried transactions, the breathless jockeying for position in the grand halls. In those moments, he had been performing a role, the successful, powerful man who could never falter. He smiled when he needed to smile, and calculated his worth based on the appreciative nods of strangers or the thickness of a signed contract. This was an exhausting masquerade, sustained only by vanity and fear. The teachings whispered through the atrium were not radical demands for poverty. Rather, they were subtle inquiries into where he had placed his deepest foundations. They questioned whether his peace hinged upon the perfection of his fortune, or if it could be cultivated in the silent compost of his own self-mastery. The thought was disruptive, uncomfortable, yet utterly liberating. The dichotomy was stark, the fleeting, glittering shine of coin versus the steady, deep burn of character. Gold, by its nature, is inert. It cannot reason, nor can it protect against misfortune. Yet he understood that a mind trained in virtue, a mind capable of reasoned judgment when panic struck, or compassion when cynicism reigned, possessed an unshakable currency far exceeding any vault's reserves. If his happiness depended on the continued flow of capital, then every economic downturn, every market tremor, was not merely a financial blow, but an existential crisis. And if his inner life was truly independent of external circumstance, then those tremors held no true power over him. They were simply events to be observed, reasoned about, and weathered. The challenge presented by the atrium was one of mental subtraction. It required him to mentally strip away layers. The expectation of applause, the need for recognition, the comfort provided by endless resources. What remained after this profound psychic emptying? Only the foundational self, the core that could breathe, reason, and feel empathy, regardless of what jacket he wore or what numbers were in his ledger. The weight he carried, he realized, was not the physical burden of his luxury, but the psychological one, the incessant, nagging fear of losing everything, and thus being deemed incomplete. This attachment to external perfection had become a subtle shackle, invisible until it was questioned by the quiet certainty of philosophy. Seneca's voice, gentle yet unwavering, spoke not of abandoning his life fully, but of altering its internal compass. It guided him toward understanding that wealth is merely an instrument for living, never the definition of the soul itself. An empty stomach can be filled. A diminished reputation can be restored through action and integrity. But true virtue, once practiced and internalized, becomes irreversible. It is self-forged and eternally accessible. This quiet moment forced him to consider the nature of human effort. He had always equated intense labor and visible success with inherent worth. But if he understood that the greatest work was the meticulous construction of his own character, the daily exercise of temperance, justice, courage, and wisdom, then suddenly, hours spent in meditation were far more valuable than years spent acquiring estates. The true investment, it seemed, was not measured in currency units, but in moral capital. He sat still for a long time, absorbing the coolness and the whispers. He saw that desire itself was merely an act of misplaced valuation. To intensely desire comfort or luxury is to hand over one's internal peace to something inherently uncontrollable. Freedom, he began to grasp, lay not in having limitless resources, but in having limited attachments. It was the practiced indifference to outcomes, the quiet acknowledgement that though fate may decree storms, his inner citadel remains sovereign. The grandeur of human civilization, with its towers and its fortunes, often obscures this simple truth. We are fundamentally rational beings whose primary need is not accumulation, but alignment. The purpose of a life should be the practice of being good, right now, in spite of what gold might say otherwise. This revelation was his true awakening, quieter and far more profound than any market boom or social victory. Every grand achievement in life seems to come with an invisible toll. We build our lives around expectations, believing that if we perform enough, if we achieve enough, then we will finally be worthy of happiness. It is a crushing burden, this weight carried silently within the chambers of the heart. The years have taught us to measure ourselves by external metrics, titles, possessions, and flawless public appearances. We learn early to anticipate not only what we should do, but how others expect us to look while doing it. This performance is exhausting, demanding a constant maintenance of an image that may not even belong to us. The sheer effort required to maintain the illusion of effortless success drains away the quiet essence of who we are. We become architects of our own facade, spending all our inner energy bracing against judgment rather than simply living in the present moment. Consider the lavish dinner party, the glittering tableau of social life. It is a stage where every smile must be perfectly calibrated, every gesture practiced to convey effortless grace and undeniable success. The conversation itself becomes less about genuine exchange and more about subtle displays of pedigree or achievement. We talk around the true self, discussing mergers, investments, and accolades, the measurable proofs of our value. But beneath the polish of these grand occasions, a different life unfolds, unseen by the polite cluster of guests. There is the internal reckoning. The moment we are alone, cloaked by the heavy velvet curtains of our own thoughts, the facade falters. We find ourselves staring into a mirror and not recognizing the weary eyes looking back. This polished self feels brittle, like fine china balanced on too many careful assumptions. The expectations placed upon us, both those inherited from family and those we have constructed for ourselves, are relentless. They whisper that to fail is unacceptable, that pause is weakness, that indifference is an abandonment of destiny. We live in a state of perpetual audition, always hoping for the nod of approval from some unseen jury. The mind becomes deeply skilled at compartmentalizing emotions. Joy must be paired with appropriate decorum. Sorrow must be delivered with aristocratic restraint. True vulnerability, the raw act of simply feeling unmanaged emotion, is seen as a social failing, something that threatens the fragile architecture of our carefully built reputation. We mistake the appearance of control for genuine mastery over ourselves. We assume that because we present a life of impeccable order and constant upward trajectory, that internal chaos must be absent. But the pressure cooker of expectation generates its own kind of suffering, a deep, unshakable ache beneath the fine silks and polished silverware. The deepest tragedy is realizing that by structuring our lives entirely around meeting external expectations, we have unintentionally rendered ourselves slaves to the whims and desires of others. Our happiness becomes a commodity, contingent upon praise or criticism, on fortune's current favor, or the changing tides of social approval. We confuse recognition with validation. We mistake being seen for truly being known. This realization initiates a difficult process of deconstruction. To dismantle the pedestal we built for ourselves, the one made of perceived achievements and expected perfection, requires courage far greater than any grand venture or profitable deal. It requires accepting that simply existing, imperfectly and messily, is enough. The weight of expectation forces us to build walls around our hearts. We convince ourselves that if we let people see the struggle, the doubt, the simple human wobble, they will withdraw their affection, their respect, perhaps even their patronage. So we build higher and polish brighter, trapping ourselves within a gilded cage of performance. The antidote lies in radical honesty, the willingness to be observed when one is at their most flawed. It means accepting that sometimes the greatest act of strength is not the brilliant retort or the spectacular accomplishment, but the quiet acknowledgement, I do not know what comes next. And for a fleeting, sublime moment, recognizing the uncertainty brings an unexpected form of profound peace. The luxury of the mind, we are learning, is not found in its capacity to accumulate knowledge or wealth, but in its ability to reject artificial constraints, the invisible chains forged by societal judgment and personal fear. The stage lights always shine brightest on the performance, but true wisdom finds its glow in the quiet corners, in the moments where no one is watching, where the only audience is simply a thoughtful self confronting the undeniable truth. That genuine worth resides not in what we possess or what we achieve for others, but in the unburdened integrity of who we genuinely are. The frantic echo of my former life still rings in my ears. A constant clatter of coin on marble, the sharp whisper of expectation, the brittle chime of social approval. I used to believe that accumulation was equivalent to existence, that more possessions meant a deeper meaning. But the whispers I heard from Seneca and the weight of countless dinners showed me otherwise. The truth, it seems, is far simpler and perhaps more frightening in its clarity. Today, I found myself drawn away from the marble halls and gilded cages into a space marked only by quiet. A garden. It was a profound contrast to the towering edifices of commerce that defined my routine. Here, time did not measure itself in quarterly earnings or market spikes. It flowed with the slow, deliberate rhythm of root growth and fading sunlight. My mind, accustomed to analyzing balance sheets and projecting future gains, found itself oddly blank, unable to assign a numerical value to the sheer existence of things. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and overripe blossoms. I walked slowly, my hand brushing against rough stone borders that seemed to absorb all artificial noise. In this stillness, an old man sat beneath the archway, tending to his plants. He was not rich by any measure. His clothes were worn, his hands deeply lined like map of seasons, and his presence radiated a profound, unshakable calm. He moved with the economy of purpose, a gesture as simple as pulling a single weed, yet imbued with immense weight. He paused his work and watched me approach, not with judgment, but with quiet inquiry. He pointed first to the immaculate rows of cultivated flowers, the roses, the lilies, each one perfect in its presentation, requiring constant care and skilled intervention to achieve that state of beauty. Then, he reached his hand toward a patch just beyond the neat borders, pointing instead to a cluster of weeds. They were chaotic, unremarkable, growing seemingly without oversight or purpose. He did not speak immediately, allowing the contrast to hang in the humid air between us. I watched them, the carefully tended blooms and the unruly scrapings of green life. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft, like gravel shifting at low tide. He said that the flowers, while beautiful, required a constant battle against nature's natural inclination. They needed weeding, pruning, shaping. Their perfection was not inherent. It was manufactured through relentless effort and control. He then shifted his gaze to the weeds. He explained that those small plants, left entirely alone, grew with fierce resilience. They did not seek approval from man or man's aesthetic standards. They simply existed, driven by an unstoppable, fundamental will to live in this place. Their method was effortless, their persistence absolute. His words resonated with the weight of forgotten wisdom. I realized that my entire life had been structured around being a cultivated bloom, a magnificent, beautiful spectacle that required immense effort and constant defense against any hint of disorder. I spent decades striving for a controlled perfection, fearing the randomness of nature, both in the garden and in my own spirit. The gardener was teaching me about types of strength. The flowers embodied control. They represented the carefully curated self, the public persona polished to gleam with success and stability. But true resilience, he suggested by pointing back to the tenacious weeds, lay in the quiet, unburdened act of simply being what one is, without the need for an audience or a perfect arrangement. I began to see my life through this new lens. I was too busy pruning myself, cutting away thoughts, discarding feelings, adopting certain tastes and philosophies just because they signaled success. I viewed genuine spontaneity as failure. I thought that freedom meant achieving a lofty, perfected state of being. Yet the simplest weed seemed freer than the most exotic lily. The challenge became deeply personal. How do I unlearn the fear of imperfection? How do I accept the beautiful chaos of an untended life? The struggle was not to achieve some grand, flawless self-mastery, but to find peace in being slightly overgrown, a little messy, fundamentally real. This garden, this simple patch of earth, felt like a mirror for my soul. It asked me to compare the painful, exhausting labor of maintaining a perfect facade against the quiet, stubborn dignity of natural existence. The wisdom offered was that worth is not measured by how much effort one can exert to look stable, but by the unwavering capacity to sustain genuine peace regardless of external forces. The cultivation I had mistaken for value was revealed to be merely a high degree of anxiety, disguised as elegance. My greatest wealth, it seemed, remained always buried beneath the surface, the simple truth of self-acceptance. The question that had guided his life, the very axis upon which his identity seemed built, was a simple one, yet utterly paralyzing in its implications. Is virtue more important than wealth? He had once treated it as a debate for philosophers in cloistered gardens, a theoretical exercise to be debated over hemlock cups. Now, standing alone with the ghosts of his former life, the abstract argument felt horribly concrete. Wealth was not just gold. It was a scaffolding built around his self-worth. It defined his relationships, validated his achievements, and silenced internal doubts through visible opulence. He lived as if material success were a shield against true scrutiny. He began to perform the mental exercise of loss. Not imagined poverty, but specific, targeted subtraction. The tailored garments he wore every morning, symbols of his station and taste, vanished in his mind's eye. His bank account credentials dissolved into meaningless numbers. The weight of his watch, an artifact signaling his punctuality and success, lifted entirely off his wrist. With each item gone, a strange vacuum opened up inside him, a terrifying emptiness that felt exactly like failure. It was natural for panic to surface. If he possessed nothing, no title, no network, no access point to curated luxury, then who was he? The answer seemed always attached to the things that defined his visible life. Who would remember the man behind the portfolio? Was there anything of him left unattached, untraded, and undeserved? The mind is a cruel place during these thought experiments. It demands anchors. It fears nothingness more than an unprepared soul. He tried to grasp onto memories. A great victory won, a social accolade received, but even those felt strangely contingent on the backdrop of his success. A grand achievement meant little if he could not afford the stage upon which to display its significance. The self-examination deepened, becoming less about what he had lost and more about recognizing what was always there, but always invisible. He started tracing the emotional weight that these things carried for him. The fear of being overlooked, the terror of judgment, the pressure to constantly justify his existence through acquisition. These were not possessions, they were mental chains. He focused on a much smaller thing, a simple act of consideration given to a passing street vendor, an observation made during a previous walk in the garden. That moment required no expenditure, commanded no social recognition, and yielded no tangible reward. It was purely spontaneous humanity. This small instance shone, remarkably bright, against the overwhelming imagined backdrop of loss. The gold felt suddenly heavy, inert. The meticulously curated life seemed less like a kingdom he ruled and more like a delicate stage, set built for an audience who might vanish at any moment. The lesson emerging from this mental stripping was profoundly simple and deeply unsettling, that his core self was surprisingly unattached to the things he thought formed its foundation. His internal landscape, his capacity for reflection, his ability to feel genuine concern, his persistent curiosity about justice, those elements remained untouched by the phantom removal of his fortune. They were not assets, they were intrinsic qualities. If these quiet inner capacities endured when all external trappings vanished, then perhaps their inherent worth far exceeded any measurement in coins or consequence. Wealth was a magnificent distraction, capable of drowning out the gentle, persistent whisper of self-knowledge. But true substance, the enduring core that withstood the imagined ruin of his entire life, resided entirely within the realm of virtue and character. The loss wasn't merely hypothetical. It was a fundamental reframing of what he believed to be real, revealing the stark truth in its resilient emptiness. He realized that sufficiency was not found in accumulation, but in acceptance, an unshakable internal fortress built against the inevitable erosion of fortune. The exhaustion of a life spent chasing prestige is often silent. It does not arrive with the dramatic clang of a fallen fortune or the sharp pronouncement of failure. It arrives instead in the quiet, aching rhythms of an overly active night. We find ourselves drawn late into the city square, under the diffused glow of a single lamp post, witnessing the ceaseless parade of modern existence. It is a gallery of selves in varying states of depletion. Some figures move with hurried purpose, shoulders slightly slumped from hours spent bent over screens or accounts. Their eyes carry a glazed look, a reflection not merely of sleeplessness, but of constant intellectual strain, the worry that nothing ever truly ends. Others are sprawled on benches, enveloped in the deep oblivion of sleep. They rest without urgency, surrendered to the necessary void. Observing these two extremes forces a profound and unwelcome contemplation. What is the true nature of necessary toil, and where does genuine repose reside? The mind naturally seeks to categorize these states. There is effort, there is cessation. But when one has lived believing that continuous activity equals inherent worth, observing stillness becomes an act of radical confrontation. I watched a merchant count coins until his fingers were stiff, his breath coming in shallow little gasps. His focus was absolute, yet tainted by desperation, the need to validate himself through volume and accumulation. Nearby, a student slept soundly, head tipped back against the cold stone, breathing deep, rhythmic sighs that promised nothing of urgency or profit. The contrast is jarring. One life is defined by an endless input of energy, the other by the complete absence of it. Yet, observing this dichotomy does not yield simple answers. The exhausted worker cannot simply choose to sleep, because his perceived self-worth is tied to the vigilance of his efforts. He feels obligated by the very mechanism that sustains him, the fear of stagnation. The sleeping person, conversely, has relinquished all claim on the moment. They are unburdened by deadlines or projections. Their rest is not a luxury purchased after labor. It is simply a state of being, permitted by time itself. My internal conflict intensifies around this observation. I have spent so long associating wakefulness with engagement, and thus with value. To slow down, to truly sleep, feels almost irresponsible in the marketplace of my own mind. It suggests an unconcern for consequence. I recall the teachings that effort itself is often meaningless if it serves a false master. The merchant's obsessive counting was not merely accounting. It was performance art meant for his own anxious ego. He was building value, minute by minute, against the invisible threat of disappearance. But what happens to the built monument when the laborer finally falls asleep? What am I trading my deepest hours for? Sleep represents the ultimate withdrawal, a temporary, necessary death that reaffirms life's fundamental autonomy from external demands. It is a primal act of uncaring. I begin to analyze the motivations behind this tireless wakefulness. Is it genuinely motivated by necessity, or is it driven by an ingrained cultural fear of being invisible? We are taught to value the industrious state, mistaking constant motion for purposeful direction. The virtue of rest, therefore, is often penalized by society as laziness, a luxury we cannot afford when striving to maintain a facade of success. The most dangerous realization dawns upon me, that I am participating in my own system of self-depletion. My pursuit of status, my elaborate schemes for betterment, require more sleepless nights and greater emotional investment than the simple act of accepting what is sufficient. The city square becomes a classroom in the architecture of desire. Here, time itself is treated as the commodity to be most aggressively spent. The sleeping people prove that some moments cannot and should not be bought or earned. This contrast, the restless striving against the profound peace of unconsciousness, is more valuable than any philosophical treatise I could read. It speaks volumes about where we draw our boundaries. Are they marked by the successful completion of a difficult task, or by the quiet acceptance that the day will eventually yield to night, regardless of how much coin was counted or what reputation was built? I start integrating this observation into my understanding of virtue. Virtue is not merely acting rationally. It is also knowing when and why to cease action. It is recognizing that true strength resides in allowing oneself the necessary withdrawal. To be virtuous, perhaps, means having the courage to rest, even when the noise of expectation demands constant alertness. The exhaustion of the mind is a subtle thing. It settles over us not with the dramatic fatigue of physical labor, but with the quiet weariness of constant performance. We have spent so much time perfecting the outward life, meticulously constructing the mask of success. The polished demeanor, the witty remark, the casual display of ease. And in that relentless effort to appear worthy, to predict every social angle, we deplete something far more vital than our energy, our authentic selves. He finds himself observing others in the bustling market square, watching how easily they offer aid, how spontaneously compassion blooms when it is not calculated or expected for credit. These moments of small kindness strike him with unexpected force, a sharp contrast to the carefully orchestrated transactions he was used to witnessing. They are unmarketable acts, offered purely because a fellow soul needed support. He recalls past interactions where every gesture felt like a performance, weighed by its social return. His internal dialogue shifts, questioning the very geometry of value. If true worth is defined by ledger entries or public applause, how do we account for the pure gift? He realizes that goodness, when given freely and without seeking recognition, possesses a gravity entirely unrelated to reputation or reward. This simple act introduces him to a radically different metric for judging human existence. It suggests that the highest forms of human currency are not gold, but genuine attention and unburdened empathy. He begins to notice how his own internal mechanisms react to this new standard. When he observed an old woman struggling with her cart, a neighbor did not stop because they were paid to. They stopped because the need was visible. There is no grand gesture here, only immediate, gentle responsiveness. The profound shift is that these small acts challenge the entire edifice of his self-perception. He has always measured human interactions by utility and cost. If kindness is invaluable, but costs him nothing except a moment of time, then perhaps the price tag we assign to virtues, like generosity or patience, is entirely misplaced. He starts linking this concept back to his previous reflections. The simple truth found in the garden about the weeds was similar. Resilience does not come from fighting nature's grain, but from accepting what simply is. These small moments of virtue are like those resilient weeds. They simply occupy space and thrive effortlessly because their existence is sufficient unto itself. He starts paying attention to his own internal landscape while traversing these busy streets. Before, he searched for the impressive, the monumental event that would validate his life narrative. Now, his focus narrows dramatically, becoming intensely localized. He notices the way a child pauses just to examine a falling leaf, or the quiet gratitude in an exchange of smiles between strangers. These are moments devoid of narrative purpose, yet they carry a deep, enduring resonance. They teach him that significance is not reserved for grand speeches or spectacular acquisitions. It resides in the mundane rhythm of shared humanity. The kindness he observes forces him to dismantle his own system of reward. He questions, if I perform a kind act merely because I hope to be seen as generous, am I truly giving? Or am I simply buying favorable social capital? This internal interrogation is uncomfortable and humbling. It demands that he look at the purest forms of goodness in himself, moments when he helped without thinking of praise, or when his genuine empathy surfaced unbidden. These moments become the true touchstones against which he measures his character. The realization settles over him. The self-worth derived from observing and performing small acts of kindness is far more stable, far more deeply satisfying than any temporary high fueled by material success. He begins to understand that virtue is not a dramatic conversion moment. It is a series of micro-choices, the accumulation of unnoticed mercies in daily life. It is the conscious choice to see another person's struggle as valid, without needing to calculate its emotional or social payoff. This gentle reorientation shifts his perspective from the large scale, the grand summation of achievement, down to the intimate detail of a single human encounter. He learns that the greatest luxury is not owning beautiful things, but possessing uncalculated compassion. The true measure of life's richness, he finally understands, is determined by the sheer weight of its freely given connections and the quality of his empathetic attention. This quiet recognition becomes the foundation upon which all future judgments of value will be built, establishing a new and profound definition of success, rooted entirely in selfless regard for others and himself. The weight of the world, it seemed, was not measured in gold. It weighed differently now, resting lightly on his shoulders during this quiet afternoon with old Marcus. Marcus, a man who had walked away from every promised zenith of wealth and acclaim. He sat across from him, seemingly comfortable in the worn cedar chair, surrounded by books rather than baubles. The initial conversation was one of gentle redirection. It did not involve sharp arguments or dramatic pronouncements about life's great mysteries. Instead, it began with simple questions, questions that were more unsettling because they demanded honesty. Marcus spoke not to critique his former life, but simply to illuminate a path he had already walked. He spoke often of the concept of sufficiency. He defined enough not by a balance sheet or an achievement plaque, but by the quiet rhythm of a morning meal and the predictable comfort of routine. Our modern world, it seemed, operates under a continuous illusion that there is always something more to attain, something higher to climb toward. The protagonist found himself repeatedly caught in the web of comparison. He had spent so long defining his self-worth by benchmarks set by society, the size of his apartment, the prestige of his associates, the sheen of his car. Marcus gently showed him that these external measurements were not inherent truths. They were merely accumulated agreements. The inner conflict was deeply painful because it required dismantling years of internalized belief. He wanted to argue, to defend the necessity of ambition and achievement, but every retort felt hollow against the steady wisdom emanating from his friend. The argument could not be won through logic. It had to be surrendered to truth. Marcus addressed the inherent human yearning for recognition. He pointed out how much energy he had expended merely ensuring that his successes were visible, that they were impressive enough, remarkable enough, to warrant a nod of approval from strangers. This exhausting performance was, according to Marcus, far more draining than any actual failure could ever be. The friend then guided him into examining the core difference between temporary acquisition and permanent being. Gold can be lost in fire. Status fades with time or scandal, but who remains when the possessions are stripped away? It is not a clever answer. It is simply the raw, untainted self. We understand that virtue was often treated as an abstract concept, a lofty ideal reserved for philosophers speaking from lecture halls. Marcus recast it into something profoundly practical, a quiet inner posture. To be virtuous, he implied, was to respond to life's inevitable disappointments not with frantic striving or emotional collapse, but with reason and calm assessment. The protagonist started seeing the profound vulnerability in his previous existence. He had been guarded by layers of success, layers that actually served as cages. The fear was not failure itself, but the return to a state of naked uncertainty, unprotected by titles or funds. Marcus challenged this core fear directly. What if nothing failed? What if everything remained just as imperfect and unpolished? This thought experiment dismantled his entire framework of security. If the foundation was supposed to be wealth, what happened when that foundation was proven to be nothing at all? The conversation became less an argument about money and more a shared excavation of regret. Marcus spoke not just of himself, but of humanity's collective habit of valuing the shiny over the stable. He illuminated the subtle art of contentment, the ability to find joy in the reliable arc of a sunset or the predictable taste of good, simple bread. He articulated that striving for external validation creates an endless debt. Every compliment received demands another response. Every purchase made demands another justification. Life becomes a perpetual performance review where the grading criteria are set by volatile public opinion. The weight lifted slightly when Marcus showed him how genuine connection, the sharing of simple bread, or the quiet listening to a worry without offering unsolicited advice, holds more durable value than any accumulated fortune. Such kindness costs nothing, but demands complete presence. The protagonist realized that true strength was not found in resisting poverty, but in mastering the response to it. It was realizing that his internal peace did not require an impenetrable fortress of possessions surrounding him. The friend smiled then, a deep, knowing expression free from irony or judgment. The lesson was simple yet monumental. Your worth is pre-installed. It arrived at birth with no accompanying invoice and requires no costly upkeep. This understanding was the most liberating revelation he had encountered in his entire search. The pursuit of desire is often depicted as a joyful ascent, but closer examination reveals it to be far more complex. We build our lives around objects and concepts that promise happiness, believing that the next acquisition, the next achievement, or the next person will finally fill some internal void. Yet this ceaseless chasing creates not contentment, but a permanent state of dissatisfaction. This deep dive into desire begins with an inventory, a methodical listing of everything we claim to want. We start by identifying these desires, treating them like valuable assets that define our identity and measure our worth. We list the exotic car, the corner office, the perfect relationship, the academic accolade. Each item seems, in its own right, a pinnacle of human striving. But as we continue this accounting, something unsettling begins to happen. Instead of satisfaction, a residue of anxiety appears alongside each desired object. When we list wealth, we are not only listing coins, we are mentally cataloging the enormous effort required to maintain that stack of coins. We realize that desiring wealth does not grant freedom. It merely binds us to the market and to others who will try to take what belongs to us. The need for upkeep, the fear of loss, these invisible weights quickly overshadow the supposed comfort of gold. We move on to desire for status. What do we truly gain by being recognized as important? We seek validation from external sources, building our self-worth upon the approval of peers and society. This examination reveals a profound instability. Status is like smoke. It shifts with the passing winds of public opinion. Today you are revered. Tomorrow, without a visible accomplishment to cling to, you risk becoming invisible. The desire for status, therefore, is merely the desire to be perceived, a craving that leaves us perpetually performing and emotionally exhausted. Then there is the desire for pleasure, the fleeting pleasures sought through indulgence or distraction. These desires are perhaps the easiest to list and the fastest to fade. They promise immediate relief from discomfort or boredom. Yet, like sugar on the tongue, their sweetness is followed by a dull ache, leaving us wanting more, further evidence of a diminishing return. The endless cycle of chasing novelty becomes its own cage. The central conflict emerges when we examine the root pain that desire attempts to soothe. We are not deficient in goods. We are perhaps deficient in an internal state of self-acceptance. Desire is fundamentally a strategy for avoiding discomfort, the discomfort of being enough, the quiet moment of reflection where we must confront our true selves without external props. This intellectual exercise quickly devolves into a kind of emotional surrender. We realize that to desire anything is to attach ourselves to its existence, and with attachment comes the inevitable possibility of suffering through its loss or change. The weight of all these attachments, the physical property, the reputation, the specific outcome, is immense. It requires us to dismantle years of deeply ingrained belief systems that equate more with better. The journey compels us toward a radically different position, surrender. This is not the resignation of defeat. Rather, it is an active choice to withdraw self-worth from all external determinants. We learn to observe desire as merely a passing thought, like watching clouds drift across a vast sky. The impulse to chase dissipates when we cease to believe in the necessity of those chases. Freedom, therefore, is found not by acquiring nothing, but by refusing to invest our peace of mind into anything that cannot be controlled or guaranteed. The greatest liberation comes from accepting indifference, not apathy, which suggests lack of caring, but a reasoned emotional detachment. It is the profound realization that my inner peace does not require your compliment, nor does it require this particular account balance. This intellectual inventory of desire becomes a powerful tool for emotional deconstruction. By questioning the value of each desired thing, we find the self remaining beneath the list, a core human consciousness unburdened by the need to perform, acquire, or prove anything to anyone else. The exhaustion that follows this process is not physical, it is existential. It is the exhausting work of dismantling one's own perceived reality, brick by emotional brick. And when we finally reach the end point of this inventory, standing in the quiet aftermath, we find a space previously occupied only by restless striving. That empty space, initially terrifying, reveals itself to be the true home, the unconditioned self, finally free from the tyranny of wanting. We stand now at the edge of understanding. Everything we have examined, the glittering emptiness of endless desire, the weight of societal expectation, the deceptive comfort of accumulation, has led us to a single, profound point: detachment. We learn about indifference or apatheia not as emotional numbness, but as a revolutionary state of internal freedom. It is the understanding that true tranquility does not come from acquiring more, nor from controlling outcomes. It comes from acknowledging what lies within our power and what belongs entirely to fate. The mind has become restless with the constant need for proof. We have spent so long trying to prove our worth through achievements, possessions, or approvals from others. It was an exhausting, Sisyphean task, but exhaustion itself is a teacher. As we look out over this calm water, the chaos of our prior anxieties begins to settle. The surface of the lake mirrors the stillness that has been sought for so long. Indifference, in this context, does not mean caring about nothing. It means directing our concern only toward what is truly within our control, our own judgments and responses. We begin to separate the events themselves from their interpretation. A setback is simply an event. Suffering arises when we label it a catastrophe and assign it meaning outside of rational reality. This distinction is the cornerstone of self-mastery. The external world remains vivid, loud, and demanding, but our internal reaction shrinks into quiet certainty. We practice letting go of attachment to specific outcomes, whether success at work, approval from a loved one, or even a predictable pleasant day. We acknowledge that while we can prepare for everything, we cannot guarantee anything. This surrender is not defeat, it is profound recognition. It is realizing that emotional peace is not contingent upon perfect circumstances. If the winds change direction, if the tide rises unexpectedly, or if fortune turns against us tomorrow, our core stability remains undisturbed. We begin to view adversity not as a punishment, but as training, an opportunity for the mind to exercise its resilience and rationality. This disciplined acceptance is perhaps the greatest form of strength. We understand that much of what we label self-worth has always been based on external metrics. How many coins one possesses, how grand one's title is, or how admired one's appearance remains. But the journey has revealed a deeper truth. Our worth is not transactional. It does not fluctuate with the market, nor diminish when praise fades. It exists simply because we are conscious and capable of rational choice. The former frantic need to perform, that elaborate mask we wore in lavish halls, begins to peel away naturally. Why bother maintaining a facade when the simple act of being honest becomes both effortless and deeply satisfying? We realize that authenticity, even if imperfect or unpolished, holds infinite value compared to the flawless fiction. The weight lifting is enormous. It is the weight of pretense. This gentle indifference to external opinion allows us to live in a state we recognize as true freedom. Freedom from the judgment of others, freedom from fear of poverty, freedom from the obligation to perform happiness. We are free to simply be where we are, with whatever resources are available at this moment, finding enoughness not in accumulation, but in appreciation. The practice is continuous and requires immense patience. It means confronting thoughts as they arise, the anxieties about tomorrow, the regrets of yesterday, and gently labeling them merely as passing mental events. They are not facts, they are echoes. By refusing to grant those echoes power over our immediate state of mind, we reclaim our inner citadel. We become masters of our own attention, redirecting it always back to the present moment and the reasoned judgment. This is the ultimate realization of virtue. That perfect self-sufficiency cannot be achieved through external means. It must be constructed internally, stone by careful stone, using reason as the mortar and discipline as the chisel. The goal is not merely contentment in hardship. It is the cultivation of a mind so robust that even when life delivers its worst blows, the inner light remains steady, rational, and unquenched. This unwavering composure, this beautiful apatheia, becomes our truest form of enduring wealth. The whispers of certainty had been calling him for weeks. He had walked away from the grand pronouncements of success and knelt before the undeniable wisdom of simply being enough. Yet, true philosophical mastery is not achieved by perfect withdrawal. It is forged in moments of imperfect return. Life, it seemed, would enforce a reckoning that transcended elegant thought experiments or gentle conversations with wise friends. The universe presented him a simple arena, the relentless pursuit of his old life's metrics. A meeting was scheduled, crucial for solidifying the future he had so thoroughly rejected. It represented not only financial standing, but the continued acceptance by the world he once feared to abandon. He prepared himself mentally for success, anticipating the familiar rush of approval and validation that always accompanied great achievement. But in the depths of his newfound clarity, a deeper impulse took root, the profound necessity of authenticity over obligation. His previous self had operated on an exhausting loop: perceive expectation, adjust behavior, achieve applause, rinse, repeat. Now, he recognized the cost of this performance was not merely emotional fatigue, but a subtle erosion of the soul's most precious reserves. As the day progressed, the weight of external demands seemed unbearable. He stood in the hall leading to the meeting room, the polished marble reflecting his uneasy reflection. The calendar minutes ticked by, counting down to a moment where he was expected to embody the successful stranger, the one who knew exactly how much himself was worth, calculated in quarterly reports. Suddenly, an unexpected wave of self-reflection washed over him. It wasn't a philosophical epiphany derived from books or conversations. It was raw, immediate insight born of exhaustion. He realized that his current pursuit of worthiness felt like building a house upon the foundation of borrowed approval. Every success he engineered was merely a shield against an unexamined internal doubt. The path to the room suddenly felt wrong. The whole edifice of expectation, the tailored suit, the important title, the meticulously scheduled itinerary, seemed like a gorgeous but fragile trap. He paused. He remembered the gentle earthiness of the garden, the resilient strength of the weed, and the quiet dignity of those who had nothing left to prove. A small internal tug-of-war began. One part of him urged compliance, the fear of losing all progress, the dread of disappointing mentors and friends, was a tangible gravity pulling him forward. The other part, fueled by weeks of self-interrogation, demanded release. It insisted that true integrity required more than mere thought. It required action. He made the conscious choice to deviate. He did not simply walk away. That would have been dramatic and easily criticized as failure itself. Instead, he allowed himself a momentary detour into reflection. Perhaps he paused to read something insignificant on a marble bench, or perhaps he spent an unnecessary few minutes observing the patterns of light falling through the stained glass, moments that had no transactional value whatsoever. The result was immediate, subtle, and profoundly significant. The meeting began without him. His absence, his deliberate lack of punctual presence, created a void. In the hyper-organized world of corporate ambition, an insignificant failure to perform as expected was a monumental event. Panic rippled through those waiting for him. Their carefully constructed schedules faltered around his detour. He watched this small ripple effect unfold. It wasn't a grand rebellion, nor was it a dramatic exile. It was simply the necessary refusal to participate in an illusion of perfect competence. He chose the unburdened moment over the profitable appearance. The fear that once gripped him, the fear of professional failure, of judgment, of becoming worthless, was momentarily replaced by an unexpected and profound calm. The initial panic felt like a physical weight, but as he let go, this tension evaporated. There was no subsequent grand pronouncement of victory. No one chased him with praise or pity. They simply adapted to his absence, reminding him that their structures had been built too tightly around the assumption of his constant presence. The moment taught him something far more valuable than any strategic failure could have revealed. The truest measure of self is not found when everything is going right, nor even in spectacular success, but precisely in the unscripted, unremarkable detours. It was a confirmation that inner peace and genuine worth are impermeable to the pressures of expectation. He stood there, observing the remnants of his forced detour, the stray light, the silence left by hurried conversation. He realized that the failure wasn't just permitted, it was necessary. It was the friction needed to polish away the residue of performance. This failure, minor and wholly uncalculated, proved beyond a doubt that the stability he sought resided not in his ledger books or his social standing, but solely within the disciplined citadel of his own mind. He had finally learned how to prioritize being overdoing, realizing that the truest monument to a life well lived was simply a steady state of internal grace. After the whispers of Seneca and the solace found in simple company, the true nature of self finally presented itself. The journey had stripped away the trappings of my former life, the expensive fabrics, the impressive titles, even the routines that once defined me. I stood at a crossroads where all perceived value seemed to dissolve into dust. What remained? Was it merely the breath in my lungs, the rhythm of my own heartbeat against the quiet insistence of the world? Defining inner fortitude became not an intellectual exercise, but a radical act of existence. The concept was tested by design, though that design was simply life itself. My old habits demanded assurance from the outside, the applause, the acknowledgement, the flawless execution. I found myself anticipating judgment, bracing for criticism, as if my very being depended on maintaining some external standard of excellence. This anticipation felt heavier than any fortune I had ever accumulated. I began to practice a deliberate self-exposure. If true worth was found in inner virtue, it could not survive the scrutiny of minor failure. It needed to be tested by small, inconsequential setbacks. I sought out moments designed to ruffle my newfound equilibrium. A sharp word from an acquaintance, a moment of public embarrassment over a trivial misunderstanding, or simply having to admit ignorance on a subject I once believed myself master of. Each instance was treated not as a failing, but as a measurement tool for the strength housed within. The initial response was always resistance. The old self reacted with swift anger or defensive rationalization, scrambling to rebuild a superficial wall of competence. These were mere reflexes, echoes from years spent prioritizing appearance over truth. I recognized them, acknowledged their drama, and then allowed them to pass without feeding them an ounce of my attention. This realization required immense effort, like wrestling an opponent who wears the weight of years of belief. The critical shift came when I learned to accept criticism not as a personal attack, but as data. Harsh words, delivered poorly or unfairly, carried no inherent moral force simply because they were spoken. They were merely sounds vibrating in the air, reflections of another person's own inner turbulence, nothing more. The genius of stoicism was here. It taught one to control the judgment on these external stimuli. I could choose how much power those careless words would hold over my peace. This ability to simply observe a critique and declare it meaningless to my core self became an unassailable shield. The training continued through observation. I watched people under simulated stress, the boardroom confrontation, the public debate where stakes felt impossibly high, the sudden revelation of deep hypocrisy. My goal was not perfection, but immutability. To find the unshakable point at the core of self that could withstand both extravagant praise and profound scorn. The mind, I discovered, is a remarkable place to practice endurance. Mental discipline became my greatest asset when faced with arguments designed to derail me, arguments rooted in ego or fear. I practiced radical neutrality. I would mentally strip away the assumption of being right, releasing the desperate need to win the debate. This silence was not empty. It was full of quiet understanding and self-possession. Failure became my most trusted mentor. A missed deadline, a poorly worded reply, a simple stumble. These moments used to send me into spirals of self-reproach. Now I treated them with the detachment of an astronomer viewing a predictable planetary orbit. They were simply events. The event happened. The interpretation was up to me. And if the interpretation was catastrophe, then by choice, I corrected that error immediately. This relentless internal refinement led to a deep and profound kind of quietude. It wasn't merely the absence of stress. It was the presence of an unshakable foundation. Fortitude, I realized, is not the booming boast of strength in battle, but the steady, subtle resilience that allows one to simply exist fully within imperfection. It is the knowledge that even if every external circumstance collapses, my reputation, my comfort, my security, the inner citadel remains untouched. This internal life became infinitely richer and more dependable than any mountain of coin I could ever count. And with this realization came a profound peace, an unearned calm that was finally, truly mine. The grand table set before him was a replica of his former life. Crystal gleamed under soft lights, and silverware whispered promises of effortless plenty. Yet, standing in this opulent setting, the sheer weight of expectation felt heavier than any fortune he had previously known. Here, at the apex of social success, lay the ghost of Chapter 3's exhausting performance. He remembered the subtle choreography of smiles, the practiced casualness with which nothing seemed to matter, while inside, a profound depletion settled like dust. He looked across the polished mahogany surface and saw not friends, but reflections, mirrors demanding a perfect portrayal of self-sufficiency. These were people who valued the immaculate facade above all else. Their conversations spun intricate tapestries of achievement and ambition, each anecdote serving only to reaffirm the value of external markers: title, income, pedigree. Earlier, he had learned, through whispers in a garden and reflections by calm waters, that true stability lay outside these visible achievements. He carried those hard-won insights like an invisible shield, subtle but unyielding. The noise of their self-congratulation seemed suddenly artificial, a glittering distraction against the quiet truth blooming within him. Tonight, however, required a different kind of courage than mere detachment. It demanded engagement with genuine humanity. He found himself studying the guests not for their monetary value, but for the subtle landscape of their souls, the flicker of worry in an eye, the strained laugh masking profound insecurity. They were all engaged in the performance, and the mask was remarkably difficult to maintain. The catalyst arrived quietly, embodied by a woman sitting near him, whose conversation had drifted away from market indices or corporate mergers. She spoke instead about the simple pleasure of watching rain fall on old stone. Her voice carried no artifice, only the steady rhythm of sincere observation. It was utterly unscripted and profoundly real. He watched her, struck by how effortlessly she held his attention. His mind, once so diligently trained to analyze perceived status and material metrics, had nowhere to fixate. There were no coins, no accolades, no measurable returns on this moment of shared quietude. It was simply enough, a sensation that felt impossibly liberating. As the conversation deepened, he slowly began to let go of the elaborate structure of his previous self. He found himself contributing not with witty, status-affirming remarks, but with genuine questions rooted in curiosity about their experiences, their doubts, and their overlooked moments of joy. He listened not just to reply, but to truly hear, accepting the messy contours of vulnerability without judgment. The shift was incremental, yet seismic. When a man nearby mentioned an insurmountable professional difficulty, the usual response would have been strategic advice or some sort of mitigating boast. Instead, he found himself simply saying, "I imagine that must be deeply difficult." The sincerity in those few words stripped away layers of posturing. It was an acknowledgement of shared suffering, devoid of solutionism. The laughter around the table, which moments before had felt brittle and manufactured, softened into something more natural. The sound of people connected by mutual empathy rather than professional necessity. He realized that true richness did not manifest in the quality of the crystal or the cost of the wine. It resided in the fragile, unrepeatable breath shared between souls. Suddenly, he saw a man near the window who was failing to appear engaged. He looked down at his polished shoe, and then up at the sky, visibly lost in thought, a momentary lapse that felt like an act of profound rebellion against the evening's demands. In that instant, all the meticulously maintained emotional barriers around him dissolved. The need to project perfection vanished. This was freedom. He gathered the remnants of his previous understanding, the lessons of Seneca, the resilience of the garden weed, the quiet strength found after hypothetical loss, and applied them here. He spoke not from a position of achieved success, but from one of profound inner stillness. His insights were rooted in wisdom that had cost him nothing, just time and contemplation. The conversation flowed with an unforced grace. He challenged their deeply held beliefs about what defines a life of merit. Was it the height of one's salary, the size of one's portfolio, or was it simply the quality of attention paid to another human being in that moment, the shared recognition of existence? The diners listened, taken aback by the unfamiliar depth and sincerity of his focus. They were accustomed to a performance. They were receiving an unvarnished reflection. This experience taught him the final, most vital lesson. Virtue is not simply something practiced alone in solitude. It is a transformative action that alters the dynamics of any space it enters. By dismantling the illusion of necessity and the expectation of perfection, he did not merely find peace for himself. He offered a profound stability to every person at that table. The true wealth was not what they accumulated, but the shared grace with which they finally allowed themselves to simply be in each other's presence, accepting imperfection, and recognizing the enduring value of connection over currency. He walked through the streets he had once seen merely as stages for display. The magnificent buildings and polished streets, which before had represented ultimate achievement or profound success, now simply looked like stone and time. Everything was still there, demanding no reassessment of his inner state. He passed a vendor selling small flowers, their vibrant colors splashed against the dull gray of the paving stones. Years ago, he would have noted the expense of the stall or the rare commodity of the petals. Now he saw only life, a delicate and temporary burst of color. This radical shift in perception was perhaps the most difficult truth of all. The old measures of worth had been meticulously dismantled. The need for wealth, the fear of failure, the burden of expectation, even the necessity of performance. What remained was a quiet, expansive field within his own heart. It was a space undisturbed by market fluctuations or the praise of strangers. He paused near a fountain, watching the water arc and fall with absolute regularity. Such predictable, simple motion held more stability than any investment portfolio he had ever consulted. His mind naturally drifted back to the whispers of Seneca, the quiet wisdom that had begun to surface years ago. The man understood now that true mastery was not achieved through grand gestures or visible accumulation, but in the small choices made in silence. It was about accepting what was and letting go of what might be, even if it meant acknowledging the unremarkable nature of enough. The journey had taught him to observe his thoughts as passing clouds, powerful sometimes, dissipating just as quickly. The urge to judge an event, to assign a value or importance to every interaction, had faded into background noise. He learned that most suffering did not spring from external events themselves, but from the judgments he affixed to those events. A delay was not a personal insult. A harsh word was merely the residue of another person's own unmanaged internal chaos. He found himself observing a group of people laughing loudly near an archway. They seemed oblivious to his presence, lost in the simple joy of shared moment. In that instant, he did not analyze their laughter or calculate its social value. He simply recognized it, a genuine human connection that demanded nothing in return, but was given freely. This observation solidified a profound truth. The most resilient human experiences are those that ask for no repayment. The city itself ceased to be an opponent or a backdrop against which he needed to prove his worth. The shadows lengthened, painting the cobblestones with shifting patterns of light and darkness. He recognized in these simple shifts nothing needing correcting or mastering. The sun did not apologize for setting. The rain fell regardless of human inconvenience. These natural rhythms were unbothered by vanity or ambition. This quiet acceptance was not resignation. It was a deliberate, powerful assertion of self-sovereignty. To accept reality as it presented itself, the mundane traffic noise, the uneven rhythm of footsteps, the faded paint on an old doorway, was to declare that his internal peace was paramount. Nothing external had the authority to breach its walls. The weight he once carried, a combination of expectations, anxieties, and material goals, felt surprisingly light. It was as if years of tight physical tension had finally released their grip. He realized that in constantly striving for an unreachable peak of perfection, he had been exhausting himself from the very depths of his being. The deepest form of strength, he understood now, was not visible or quantifiable. It resided in the capacity to simply rest within one's own acceptance. He slowed his pace, letting the familiar rhythm of existence carry him forward. His previous life had been a relentless performance, requiring endless maintenance and constant audience approval. Now, the only audience he required was himself, a self that found adequate worth not in accomplishment or fortune, but in sustained presence. This quiet state became his new currency, infinitely more valuable than any pile of gold or title held on paper. The journey had stripped him bare, yet left him feeling richer and more substantial than ever before, rooted not in circumstance, but in the durable soil of accepting life exactly as it unfolded. The journey does not end in a grand revelation or a sudden fortune. It finds its conclusion in the simple, quiet rhythm of being enough. All the rigorous mental exercises, the confrontations with Marcus, the detached observation at the water's edge, they were all steps toward this single point, self-acceptance. The world did not suddenly bestow peace, it merely ceased to be a threat. The protagonist finds himself in a place of profound stillness, perhaps simply walking through a sunlit courtyard or sitting by an open window. There is no extraordinary event, no dramatic dialogue needed. Only the quiet reality of breath and presence remains. He understands now that true freedom is not found in acquiring the ideal life, but in ceasing the fight to achieve it. The currency he once chased, status, applause, material perfection, was nothing more than a complex exchange of borrowed anxieties. He was always spending his inner stability for external validation. Consider the weight he had carried, the burden of expectation, the exhausting performance at lavish tables, the constant mental accounting required to prove that he deserved to exist in comfort and success. That immense expenditure of energy finally finds its source of release. It is not given back by others, it is simply released from within. He contemplates the concept of sufficiency. To be enough. This idea is deceptively simple, yet profoundly revolutionary. It challenges the deepest human programming that tells us we must constantly earn our place through external achievement, through accolades, coins, or titles. To accept oneself as sufficient means accepting one's inherent value, regardless of utility or market worth. The internal monologue shifts from questioning what he lacked to affirming what was always present. He observes the simple act of watching light change on a wall, noticing the way dust motes dance in an effortless stream, a perfect metaphor for unforced existence. Effortless and beautiful precisely because it asks for nothing in return. This new sense of internal wealth is something that cannot be taxed, stolen, or invested. It belongs entirely to him. He realizes that by relinquishing the need to perform his worthiness, he has become profoundly rich. His self-esteem no longer relies on comparison with others. It is an absolute measure. Where before he saw value in accumulation, more coins, a bigger title, a finer garment, he now sees value in subtraction. Subtracting anxiety, subtracting pretense, subtracting the need to control every outcome. The fewer attachments he maintained, the lighter his spirit became, and the more expansive his life felt. He understands that being enough is not a destination reached after monumental success. It is a steady state of being, a gentle repose found in the present moment. It requires an active, constant turning away from the seductive noise of more. Every time he feels the familiar urge to compare himself, or to judge his quiet life against the perceived splendor of another's existence, he pauses. He reminds himself that inner peace is always a local endeavor. The journey culminates in a serenity that moves beyond mere contentment. It is an abiding trust in one's own inherent structure. The self, unshackled from external determinants, becomes its own most reliable foundation. This foundation holds steady when the markets crash, when friendships fade, and when fortune decides to abandon him entirely. This quiet wisdom allows him to engage with life with a radical lightness. A simple walk through the city is no longer an exercise in observation for philosophical critique, but simply being present within the flow of existence. He sees the mundane beauty, the scent of baking bread, the casual exchange between neighbors, the deep blue of the sky on a clear day, and experiences it fully without applying a layer of judgment or commercial significance to it. He has learned that virtue is not a difficult mountain peak to be scaled. It is the quiet, flat plateau upon which he finally rests. It is the state of unburdened being. The most profound act of self-mastery was simply ceasing the attempt at mastery. By accepting himself as inherently valuable, merely by existing in the flow of life, he found a wealth infinitely greater than gold, far surpassing any transient status or fleeting pleasure. This realization does not breed complacency, but rather a deep engagement with reality. It is the courage to simply live, fully and honestly, moment by moment, understanding that this quiet persistence, this sustained state of self-acceptance, is the ultimate philosophical achievement,